All right, we're ready for Judges chapter 6 in our study tonight. This is the outline we are following and have been following from Wiersbe. 3 major points to the book: apostasy, 1 and 2. And 3 to 16, that's where we are. It deals with our apathy, 1 and 2, apostasy, 3 to 16, and anarchy, 17 to 21. I'll share with you an alternate outline. This is from Micah himself. I've been impressed with his outlining ability, and we're working on a number of outlines on other books that you'll never see that we're working on throughout the week. But anyway, I was impressed with his analysis of Judges, the need for Judges, the work for the Judges, and the time of the Judges. Same division, 1 to 2, 3 to 16, and 17 to 21. All right, we're dealing with the work of the Judges, as he words it, or the apostasy. That's where we are. We have dealt with some of the Judges thus far. We are now ready for point D here. Chapters 6 to 8 deal with Gideon, as this section, or at least as Wiersbe has outlined it, outlined by the judge himself, or herself, as the case may be. And we're ready to look at the case of Gideon. All right, this is the cycle. We said we'd look at this each time, and you may get tired of looking at this cycle. But hopefully this will be ingrained in our minds before we get through, that that's what Judges is all about, keeping going through this cycle. Israel serves God for a period of time. Sometimes it may be as long as 80 years. It may be 40 years, or 20 years, whatever the case may be. And then they go back into sin, and then they are oppressed, and they cry out to the Lord, and God raises up a judge, and they are delivered, and they serve God again for a while. This cycle goes on and on all through the book of Judges. Now, I've asked you to try to memorize these. We're not going to go back, ask someone to recite those. But hopefully you're keeping up. We're only on our 5th judge thus far. And so here's where we are. We have Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and now we have Gideon. And that's as far as we've got. So we've got several to go. So you might make a list of those. Keep rehearsing those in your mind. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and now we're ready for Gideon. Question number 1. If you missed this one, then you hadn't been paying attention. Give me a short summary of chapter 6. All right, yes. It deals with Gideon and his work, but now we have 3 chapters that deal with Gideon. And we have chapter 6, then we have chapter 7, and then we also have chapter 8 dealing with Gideon. So what is chapter 6? Well, we could just call it Gideon. I call chapter 6 the call of Gideon. This is the call of Gideon, of getting Gideon to the work and to the task of being a judge, and his hesitancy to do so. And we're going to talk more about some of that, his hesitancy, as we go along. 5 things happen in this chapter. We have the Midianite oppression because the people went back into sin. So here we are going in that cycle again. We have God sending a prophet that's unnamed. We have the call of Gideon to judge, and Gideon destroys the altar of Baal. And then we have the Midianites prepare to invade. And then Gideon thinks he needs assurance before he's ready to go battle. We don't see a battle at all here in chapter 6. We don't see that to chapter 7. So we've got more about Gideon in the next chapter. Now there's more said in chapters 6, 7, and 8. There's more space devoted to this judge than any other judge, only by a few verses. We have 100 verses devoted to Gideon. The second to that would be 96 verses. So there's a great deal of information told to us about Gideon and his work in this period. So we're going to spend a little time. In fact, 3 weeks we're going to look at chapter 6 tonight, and next week 7, and the next on chapter 8. But there's another thing that I'm learning, particularly from chapter 6. There is more said about Gideon's personal challenges of faith than any of the other judges. The first 4 judges, we're on our 5th. The first 4 judges were seemingly good judges. But starting with Gideon, things begin to go south. We have a judge here that, does he do his job? Yeah, he does his job. But he has trouble accepting the message of God. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to save time toward the end and drive home some very practical stuff. If we don't get this practical theme from Judges 6, when we've missed a great opportunity. But as one writer says, he started out as a coward in chapter 6. He proceeds then as a conqueror in chapter 7 and most of chapter 8, and he ends as a compromiser at the end of chapter 8. And so indeed, he's a changing man. He does start out as a coward. He reminds us of what character in the Old Testament that was given a task and kind of shied away. I don't know. Moses, yeah. Moses did that. And we're going to make some comparisons to that as we go along. Question number 2, who was the enemy that oppressed the people in this chapter? The Midianites. Let's go and get another question. Question 4, how long did the oppression last? 7 years. And let's get question 3, and then we'll go back to our text. Start working our way through some things we know about Gideon. All right, he's a mighty man of valor. All right, his family seems to be poor. He's the son of Joash. He was from the Manasseh. He did some farming, didn't he? He's thrashing wheat. We know a few things about him. He seems to be not a arrogant guy. We don't accuse him of thinking that he's the best there is. In fact, he doesn't seem to have much confidence. And we will talk about that as we go along. Let's start with the Midianite oppression in verses 1 to 5. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and as I said, I want us to save some time toward the end to drive home some practical stuff. There's some good stuff in this chapter, I think, that's very practical. All right, here we have the Midianite oppression. What happens here is we're going to see Israel goes into sin. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian. What happened there? And then they cry out to God. So here's that cycle. They go into sin. God allows an oppressor to come, and then they cry out to the Lord. And that's at least the first 3 stages of the oppression. Verse 1, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Here they go again. Same cycle again. What evil is it they're doing? Well, evidence in the context is they're serving Baal. They have turned to idolatry. So much so that when, later in the context, when the idols are destroyed, they are upset and want to kill the man who destroyed their idols. Now that's not the enemies. That's not the Midianites wanting to kill him. That's the children of Israel wanting to kill him. They're wanting to kill Gideon because he has destroyed their idols. That's how far they've gone into idolatry. And so they did serve God for 40 years, but then they just gradually went back into sin, and now the oppression comes, as we're going to see, for 7 years. All right? Now we have in verse 1b through verse 6 that the Lord delivered them in the hand of Midian. So the Lord delivered them in the hand of Midian for 7 years. Let's get where Midian was on a map and see if we can make some sense of all of this. This is the here we go. The Salt Sea, the Dead Sea. And then we have just south of that down here is the region of Midian. And so they were much further south of this. And while we're right here, let me back up to another map. And we have the Amalekites. This again is the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea right here. And the Amalekites are right here within that circle. They join in, and seemingly some Arabs may have joined in with them that we'll talk about at verse 3 in just a moment. So that is the enemy that God allowed to oppress them because of their sin. Now let's notice at verse 1b. He allowed Midian, delivered them in the hand of Midian for 7 years. That's the period of oppression. Now the hand of the Lord was against them and they prevailed. How bad did it get? Verse 2 and verse 3. Notice, very good. The Midianites didn't come in and occupy the land and then drive the Israelites out. And so they were in control of the land. They just come in and invade, and then they go back. But in order to flee for their safety, they had to go to caves and to strongholds in the mountains. And whenever Israel would sow their crops, the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the people of the east. Apparently some band of Arabs. would come up against them. So that's at least 3, but we often talk about the Midianites and the Amalekites fighting against them. How bad did it get? Verse 4. Now you just think about if you planted a big garden to feed your family, that was how you was going to feed your family, and you had a crop of animals that you were going to kill and eat. You had some cattle you were going to eat, and some hogs you were going to eat, or whatever it may be. You wouldn't have that if you were a Jew, but if you were doing that in the present day, and just as everything gets ready, just about to kill or to harvest the crop, some of the neighbors come in and take every bit of that away from you, and there's nothing you can do about that. That's the kind of situation, indeed, that they were in. They didn't leave a sheep or an ox or a donkey. And they would come up with their livestock in their tents, and they were as numerous as locusts. In other words, they overpowered them in number, that is Israel in number, and that without number they would enter the land and they would destroy it. Now, verse 6 says, what happened? Yeah. Since they had destroyed all their crops, their suffering, they were so impoverished that finally they cry out to the Lord. That's part of that cycle. They go into sin. They don't think much about the consequence of it. And God didn't send Midian, but God allows Midian to come in and do this to them. God is disciplining them. God is bringing some form of discipline upon them. They're going to learn their lesson, at least for the time being, about their sin. And so now they cry out to the Lord. We got to have some relief from this. And God hears indeed their cry. Now let's start at verse 7. God sends a prophet. We often talk about Samuel being the first prophet. There was prophets before that. There were prophets, for example, Moses was a prophet. But at this period, this is a prophet that's unnamed. We don't know who he is. God sent a prophet to them. And let's see what he said. This was in response. It came to pass that when the children of Israel cried because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel. So this is in response to their cry. He doesn't send the judge just yet. He's going to come. God sends a prophet. What does this prophet say? What's his message? Basically, it's twofold. Absolutely. Yes, it's a reminder of what God has done for them. Look how richly blessed you've been. Now you are being oppressed. But let me tell you what's going on here, the prophet is saying. Look at verse 8. Thus says the Lord, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you out of the house of bondage. In other words, I delivered you from bondage of Egypt. I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and I drove out all before you and gave you their land. I brought you out of Egypt, I took care of you through the wilderness, and I brought you to this land, and I drove out the enemies, and I gave you this land. How much better could God have been to you? God has richly blessed you. The point is, and we'll make this application later, they had not been, they were not appreciative of the blessings. There's ingratitude on their part. They haven't taken advantage of the blessings. Then he adds at verse 10, I told you what? Told you not to fear the gods of the Amorites. In other words, which is implying, because this was in the context of continuing their job of driving them out of chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Judges, they did fear the gods and they didn't drive them out. So this is the consequence of it, because you didn't do your job. But here's the second part of his message. What was it at the end of verse 10? You've not obeyed. You just didn't do the job. You didn't obey. You're not obeying now. So the prophet came to them, and they're crying out, and the prophet came and said, basically saying, let me remind you what the problem is here. The reason you are oppressed, the reason Midian is here, the reason you're suffering is you didn't appreciate what I did for you, you didn't stay obedient, and you're not obedient now. That's where the problem is. All right. Now, let's go further. Let's look beginning at verse 11. Here's the call of Gideon to be the judge. Now again, the judge is a military deliverer. There was more than that they did. But he's primarily a military deliverer. And let me get ahead of myself to suggest a very practical thing. God often chooses the most unlikely person for the job. If you were of the children of Israel and you had cried out to the Lord, we need a military deliverer to deliver us, do you think for 1 minute you would have gone to the house of Joash and picked Gideon as the military deliverer? I don't think I would have. Because he doesn't seem like he's very confident. I mean, let's just stop and think. If we're going to war and we get to vote on who's going to be the top general, the top military man in the nation that's going to lead us. I'm not talking about the president, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that's going to lead, or maybe the head of the Pentagon. And we go find a person that doesn't have any military experience and doesn't have any confidence and don't think they can do the job, and we're going to vote and say, this is the man we think that needs to lead this military. Most unlikely person. And we're going to see that with reference to Gideon. All right, here's what happens. We're going to see two things by the time we get to verse 24. An angel of the Lord comes and calls upon Gideon, and then we're going to see the sign that the angel was from God. Well, let's talk about the angel coming. Let's start at verse 12. There's interaction here, and mark some things as we go along because we're going to make some practical things from that. The angel of the Lord came. Now, that angel later is identified at verse 14 as being the Lord. Some have thought this is Jesus, the Son of God, and I don't think so. I think it's saying that the angel came and had the appearance of a man, but is identified as an angel, and when the angel is speaking, he's speaking from and as the Lord. I don't think he's saying that this was Jesus, the Son of God. Some have argued that, and I don't see the evidence of that. But be that as it may. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, and Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, that was a descendant, Abiezer was a descendant of Manasseh, and so that shows which, as a part of the tribe of Manasseh, which family he was from, while his son Gideon thrashed wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. That's not normally, there'd be the thrashing floor where the wheat would be thrashed, but he's off at the winepress doing that, trying to save some of the wheat that they might have. That's what he's trying to save it from the Midianites. And the angel appeared to him, and what did the angel say? Verse 12. The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. His reaction was, you might mark this or underline it, verse 13. Seems to be some doubt. You say the Lord be with you, you mighty man of valor, but if the Lord's with us, then why has all this happened to us? Where's he putting the blame? Seemingly on God, isn't he? Why has all this happened if God's with us? And where are all the miracles that we heard about? In other words, our fathers have been telling us about miracles that they, from generation that happened in Egypt, coming through the Red Sea, and etc. We've heard about all that. Where's all that now? What else did he say? Verse 13. I'm sorry? Yeah, God's abandoned us and delivered us into the hand or forsaken us. So if God's with us, why has all this happened? God's the one forsook us. You say go and I'm a mighty man of valor, God be with us. I don't see the evidence of that. What did the angel say in response to that? Verse 14. Go in the might of yours. Notice that emphasis on might. Go in the might of yours and you'll save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? You are a mighty man of valor. You go in might because I'm with you and you will save Israel. What was his reaction to that? Yes. Yes. Notice verse 15. How can I save Israel? Why? Why did he say that? My clan is the weakest and I'm the least in my father's house. What does he mean by that? I'm not sure. He may mean he's the most insignificant. That's probably what he means. Some have speculated, and it is conjecture, I think, that he is, we see by the time we get to verse 25, his father has idols, has Baal on his place. And he may have been one that had not bowed to Baal, and so he may have been one, and again there's some conjecture, been kind of ostracized by the family because they're all worshiping Baal, and he hasn't yet bowed down to Baal. Maybe he's kind of the least respected in the family because of that. So who am I to go deliver? Because I'm the weakest we're just a small clan and amount to nothing, and I'm the weakest one of them all, or the most insignificant one of them all. And so I don't see how this could be true. Notice he's arguing with God. You think we ever argue with God? All the time. We're going to see more about that in a moment. All right, now let's go to verse 16. The angel, said here to be the Lord, said what back to him? I'll be with you, and you shall surely defeat the Midianites. That's the third time the angel has said something to him. Now, what was the reaction to that at verse 17 and 18? If I have found favor, show me a sign that you've talked with me. Do not depart from me until I come back and bring an offering, and and the angel said, I'll wait for you. So I want to see sign. I want to see proof. So notice 3 times he said, you're a mighty man of valor. I've sent you. Well, I don't think I am. Go in this might of yours, and you shall defeat the Midianites. Well, I'm the weakest clan. I will be with you and you defeat them as one man. Notice that assurance, as if you were fighting one man. You're going to fight all this nation of the Midianites and the Amalekites and those Arabs that are with them. You're going to fight them all as if they were one man. It's going to be an easy battle. You're going to be able to conquer. Well, if I found favor, then show me a sign. All right, let's move to that. The sign that the angel was from God. What was the sign? Before we work through those verses, basically, what was the sign? Now, this is important because the Lord's already told him, the Lord's already talked to him. He's waiting for a sign, and he's going to see the sign, and he still doesn't have the faith that he needs. This is a story, chapter 6, of the personal struggle of the faith of Gideon. So let's see what he says. Starting at verse 18, or verse 19. Gideon went in and prepared a young goat, and got the flour and put the broth in a pot, and came back out to the angel. And what did the angel say do? Lay those on the rock, pour the broth on it, and so he did. And what did the angel do, verse 21? Took his staff and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and then what happened? The most impressive thing. Yeah, where'd the fire come from? Out of the rock. That's amazing. Fire came out from the rock and consumed the meat, and the angel then departed out of his sight. Now you think how that must have been impressive. It's not that he went over there and he had some fire and he put it on and then it consumed the meat, but he just touched it with his staff, with his stick, and fire came from the rock. Now then, verse 22, what was the conclusion Gideon came to? Yes, he is who he said he was. This was that he perceived he was an angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Now let's stop there. What conclusion has Gideon come to, and what should that mean to him? We don't know the rest of the chapter. We don't know anything else. We ain't got that far. At this juncture, what should Gideon be saying and doing? He should be all in. Yeah. I'm all in on this. I just saw evidence this man is from God. I just saw the strongest of evidence. I saw this miracle was no different than water being turned to wine, was it? Or raising the dead. This was a miracle that has been performed. He saw evidence. The angel is from God. And so when the angel said, you are a mighty man of valor, I must be a mighty man of valor. When he says, I'll defeat the Midianites as one man, I must be able to defeat the Midianites as one man. When he says, I'm the man for the job, I must be the man for the job. Doesn't work that way. Now, at verse 22, while we're there, what's his fear? That he's seen the angel of the Lord face to face. It's implied by the time we get to the next verse, though it's not specifically stated. He seems to be a little bit afraid. I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face. He thinks he might die. So, verse 22, the Lord assured Gideon he wouldn't die. And so now that's important because of something else comes on the scene in just a moment. At verse 23, how the Lord spoke to him because the angel of the Lord has left, I'm not sure. But the Lord assured him, said, peace be with you, do not fear, you will not die. You've seen the angel of the Lord face to face, and you're not going to die. You have that assurance. Now, verse 24, what did Gideon do? He built an altar to the Lord. You see, that was not common because the nation had been given to Baal. They're worshiping idols. But he built an altar to the Lord, and they called it the Lord's Shalom. To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Now, we're ready to shift gears. So here's what's happened in 1924. The angel came, called Gideon. He argued with the angel. He saw the evidence indeed, and he came to the conclusion, this angel's from God. I know he is. And he was given assurance, you're not going to die. Now let's start at verse 25 now and start working our way through. This gets even more interesting. Let's get question number 5 out of the way. Start with 6 first. What promises did the Lord make to Gideon? There was more than one in this context. I'm just talking about really the whole chapter for that matter. What promises did he make? We just dealt with one. You're not going to die. What was another one earlier than this? Yeah, I'll be with you and you'll be successful and you'll defeat them as one man. There's more promises, but that's essentially the ones we were wanting to see. Now, question number 5, what did Gideon do at night and why? All right. He took down the altars and the idols of Baal and Ashereth, and he tore that all down, and he did it at night. Why? Tim? He didn't want the people around him to know. What do you think? What does that tell you? Yeah, tells me they've gone a long way. All right, let's deal with a little technical difficulty here first about how many bulls there are involved. At verse 25. Came to pass that night that the Lord said to him, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal, etc. Now we'll come back to what he's supposed to do with those. How many bulls were there? Was there one bull or two bulls? Because the text doesn't actually read, take 2 bulls. It says, take the second bull. But some think, and the most common thought is that there are 2 bulls that are referred to here, and the first one is mentioned, would be his father's young bullock, and the second one is to be one of 7 years old. That's the 2. And he offered the second of those. But what did he do with the first one? Well, we don't know if that be the case. There's another idea about that, and I think is probably the correct. It seems to make more sense in the flow of the context that there's only one bull mentioned here. You say, well, it's mentioned the second bull. Colin Daylich makes the observation there was only one bullock mentioned here, and that we are to understand that the bullock, namely a young bullock, was the second bullock as being second in the age among the bullocks of Joash. Wouldn't necessarily be the one that would be of that age that fit this description of 7 years. And what was the significance of 7 years? I don't know. Other than it may have corresponded with the 7 years of their oppression. But was that the reason? I don't know. It's not told. So it seems to me that there's one bull, because as you go through that, he keeps talking about him offering this bull, but it doesn't tell what happened to the other bull. But it doesn't word it as 2 bulls, it mentions the second bull. Probably the second of the bulls of his father, which would have been one 7 years of age. So, it's not a big deal, it's just a A little difficult to figure out exactly what was that all about. All right, now let's work through that. In verses 25 to 27, the Lord told him, take your father's bull. Now, whether it's one or two, that's not significant for the point we're going to make. Take this, we're going to present it as one. Take this bull of your father's, go get your father's bull, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has. This is his father's idol that has been set up on his father's place. Go tear down the idol on your father's place and cut down the wooden image that is beside it. Now, we talked about the Baal being the male god and Ashereth being the female goddess. And that's probably what this second thing is that's mentioned here. But here is the altar and the image, or the idol and the altar. Tear all of that down and build an altar of the Lord on top of the rock in its proper arrangement, and take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering. And you're going to use the wood from the image and make the sacrifice. That's what you're going to do. All right, that's simple enough. Now, verse 27 gets interesting. So Gideon took 10 men from his servants. Now, there's a little problem here. He's pictured as a family of poverty, but he had servants. I'm not sure about all of that. Probably was not in the deep poverty we think he was. But anyway, be that as it may, he took servants and did as the Lord had said to him. He did exactly what the Lord said. But, this was a big but. Because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. He had just been told that this was an angel of God, and he knew it was an angel of God and saw the evidence that this was an angel of God, and God had said, you're not going to die. Do you think he really believed that? He's struggling. He's struggling. He's struggling. And that's what I want us to see. He feared. Now, what do you think he thought was going to happen to him? What did happen next? Yeah, the next day they wanted to come and kill him. And he knew that. He knew how deep this idolatry had gone. But the Lord had assured him he wouldn't die. But I'm not sure he's fully convinced and understands that. Now, some commentators say we're too hard on Gideon when we condemn him for that. But I think it's a picture of struggling. We struggle oftentimes. And we can talk about believing the Word of God, and we can't understand why our denominational friends can't accept Mark 16, but it may be another point we're struggling with it. We're having a hard time swallowing. Maybe like God's still on his throne and in control, maybe. All right, start at verse 28 now. And 28 to 32, the men of the city were upset. So the next morning, interesting question was raised. What was their question? They found it all torn down. Verse 29. Who's done this thing? I'll make a good sermon title. Who has done this thing? Somebody has dealt with the sin, and who's done this thing? Make a good sermon, wouldn't it? Who's done this thing? Would your name come to the top? Somebody has been tearing down the altars. Who's done this thing? Would your name be mentioned? Would my name be mentioned? They said it was Gideon, the son of Joash. So now what do? They run over to the house of Joash, and what happens? Yeah, we're going to kill him. What was Joash's reaction? Remember, this was his idol on his place. It's a good question. If you didn't hear the question Kevin just raised, does that mean that he was saying, let Baal take care of it? Some suggest that what Joash was doing was defending the one true God. I have a hard time thinking that this was his altar that hadn't been torn down yet, till his son does. Some think he was more defensive of his son than he was of his God, that blood's thicker than water. That very well may be the case. He's not interested in defending the God, but he's more interested in defending his son. Or it may be that he's interested in defending his son, and he's been influenced by his son, because there has to be some knowledge that his son thinks he's talked to God, or he's talked to an angel of God, and he saw evidence that God had told him to do this, and he had to know that this bull had been taken and killed and sacrificed, and his altar had been torn down. Maybe he's learning a little bit from his son. I don't know. But here's what he does. He says at verse 31, are you going to plead with Baal? Or plead for Baal? Why do you save him? Why don't you let him plead for himself? If in other words, if Baal is strong enough, it makes me wonder if he's not being influenced by his son to some degree. If Baal is who y'all claim he is, then let him defend this. Let him rise up. If he's that great of a God, let him do that. So they call the place Jerubbaal, which simply means let Baal plead. They began to call him, that is, call Gideon Jerubbaal, because he would plead against Baal. That was the idea. Now, let's start at verse 33. And let's see if we can finish with this, and I want to get to some practical things. What happens in 33 to 35? All right, yes, the Midianites all gather to do battle against Israel. How many were lined up to battle? We'll see that in the next chapters. We'll save that for that. I'm learning at verse 35. Here is a tribe that may have learned their lesson from the rebuke from chapter 5, and that is Asher is on the scene this time, which they were not before. But now, let's go to verses 36 to 40, and I want to finish that quickly. What does Gideon do here? God tells him, all right, now we're ready for battle. Let's get ready. Let's go. And he says, but wait a minute. I need another sign. And Gideon suggests the sign. What's his first sign that he asks for? I'm going to put... All right. And he goes out the next morning, and how wet was it? The ground was as dry as could be, and the fleece, he could squeeze water out and fill a bowl. God showed him a very strong sign. Was that enough? Got to have another sign. And let's reverse that the next day. And God responded. And so here you have a man struggling with his faith. And now we're ready for battle. He still wasn't convinced. All right. Now, with that in mind, I want us to go to some practical things here. Let's list some practical things. We won't dwell on all these. I want to get to some, and we have another page of those. Here's some practical stuff we take home from the book. People are slow to learn because we've been through this cycle before. We need to know our history. We need to know the history of the church. We need to know the history of sin, the history of apostasy. Because we're doomed to repeat it. They kept repeating this cycle over and over. You'd think they'd learn their lesson, wouldn't you? But we're repeating things now that were done 50 years ago or 100 years ago. We haven't learned our lesson yet. We're doing some of the same things that happened years ago. And so people are slow to learn. The Lord allows things he doesn't cause. God didn't send the Midianites, but he allowed the Midianites to come. We learn God rules in the kingdoms of men. God hears the cry of an oppressed people. Number 6, they brought this on themselves, verse 10. Number 6 on the screen here. God uses the most unlikely people. You may think, I don't have any talent. You may be thinking this to yourself. I don't have talent, and I don't have much to contribute to the cause of the Lord. And yet the Lord may have a battle for you to fight, and he may use the most unlikely people to accomplish that battle. And you may be the one that I can't fight it, nor can anyone else, but you can go in and you can deal with that. God uses most unlikely people. Gideon doesn't impress me as the strongest military leader, but God used him. But neither did Moses, for that matter. Look at number 8. We will be tested to see if we're going to be loyal to family or to God. Now go back to verse 25 to 27. When after he saw the strong evidence, God tells him, I'll tell you what I want you to do now. I want you to go to your father's idol that he has set up on his property and destroy it. And I tell you what, that's a challenge. That's a test. Are you going to be loyal to God or to family? This is where push comes to shove. That's powerful. God's going to put you to the test. It may come to, am I going to stand with God or am I going to stand with family? Sometimes we stand with family against God. I just can't go. I just can't go against family. Gideon, we may minimize and say, he lacked a lot of faith, and he did. But I want to tell you, he had faith enough to stand against his daddy, didn't he? Had a lot of faith. Here's another lesson I learned. To serve God, number 9, we must tear down the wrong altars. We must tear down the wrong altars. Altars that are the wrong altars have got to be torn down. You may not know of any literal altars, but there are altars all around us that have got to be torn down before we can serve our God. And I like number 11. It's not original with me. I like this. The first challenge is to practice faith at home. If we don't practice it at home, how can we practice it anyplace else? In other words, God's saying, okay, you've got your faith now. You know I'm speaking to you, and you know what I've told you is true. And I'm paraphrasing that. Now go start at home, and let's start taking the idols out at your daddy's place. That's a challenge. Let's start practicing your faith at home. Because if you can't practice it at home, it's not going to be revealed anywhere else. Some people can't practice their faith at home. They don't practice their faith at home. It's not going to be any good anywhere else. All right, we got 2 or 3 minutes. Here's some more. We pictured Gideon as having trouble believing God. I have a sermon on believing God. Do you really believe God? Moses had trouble believing God. And in fact, God said, because you did not believe me, you'll not enter into the land. Numbers 20 and verse 12. So we often question God like Gideon did. One of the questions, look at verse 13. The question, if paraphrased, basically says, does God really care about us? If God cares about us, why is all this happening to us? Why is God letting this go on? If God's with this nation and God's blessing us, then why are we in such a mess as we're in? And here's some things that are answers given in the context. You see, the chastening, allowing Midian to come in and bring them to their knees, why did God allow that? Yeah, make them remember him. And they cried out to him. And that was because he did care. And so when we allow, sometimes you see your children making mistakes and you let them make mistakes to learn a lesson. And you say, why didn't you salvage them for that? It's because you cared that you allowed them to make some mistakes. It's because you do care. So Gideon's question, does God really care about us? The fact that God allowed Midian to come in shows that he did care. Secondly, verses 7 to 10, God's rebuke is evident. When he sent a prophet and said, y'all are not doing right, that was evidence he cared. And thirdly, the promise that I'll help you, and I'm here, and I'm sending you to deliver shows he cared. There was more than abundance of evidence I do care. Look at verse 14. The second question was, that shows he's having trouble believing God, does God really know what he's doing? Now, that's not how it's worded in the text, but isn't that really what he's asking? Do you know what you're doing here, God? Why would I word it that way? Because he doubted God. When God said at verse 13 that I will save you, well then I'm the, how can I save Israel? I'm not sure I can. He's doubting God. God, do you know what you're doing? See, I'm from Manasseh, and I'm of the smallest family of Manasseh, and I'm kind of the most insignificant one in my family. Do you know who you're picking here? Do you really know what you're doing? Do you think we ever question God and ask, do you know what you're doing here? Sure we do. When we look at a text and say, I just don't see how that's going to work. I don't see how spanking a child is going to work. We're asking God, do you know what you're doing here? We do that with church discipline. God, do you really know what you're doing? Because I don't think this works. I just don't think that works. The third question was, will God take care of me? Why would I raise that question? What was his question starting at verse 25? Or he didn't word it as a question, but when he was assured God is speaking to him, he thought he would die. When he was told he wouldn't die, he went out and did this matter of taking the idol down by night so no one would see him. Because he feared for that. He was assured the message was from God. He knew he wouldn't die, but he was fearful to do the task. And so his question really was, will God take care of me? Questions? Yes, ma'am. Two things. I think the statement in Judges 2:10 is probably not a broad statement, or it is a broad statement, but it doesn't include every single person. There was a generation rose up that mostly did not know God. There were still people who did know God, but as Deborah came back, she was teaching, she was a prophetess, and so they're reinstilling this faith in God during that period of 80 years. So they had 80 years of solid teaching, and they had 40 years this last time, and they go back into sin. Good question, though. That's a real good question. Chapter 7 next time.